Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Gossip Star Vibe. Tensions are at their peak as the conflict between Kendra, Rasheeda, and Kirk Frost continues to spiral. What began as mere gossip has now turned into a major confrontation, with Kendra making a shocking allegation that has stunned everyone. She has claimed she spent the night with Kirk, and the fallout has been immediate. The story is spreading rapidly, leaving people questioning whether Kendra is telling the truth. Rasheeda, Kirk's wife, is outraged and refuses to accept Kendra's claims. She remains convinced that Kendra is only trying to stir up trouble. However, as the rumor spreads further, uncertainty begins to take root. Is there any validity to Kendra's words? Could Kirk truly have betrayed Rasheeda in such a devastating way? The situation is reaching a breaking point, with emotions flaring, hidden truths surfacing, and social media ablaze. One crucial question hangs in the air. Who is being honest, and how will Rasheeda cope with these shocking developments? The drama is far from over, and the next twist could turn everything upside down. Stay tuned as this chaotic story unfolds. More surprising details are just around the corner. The atmosphere was thick with unease as Rasheeda sat in her living room, phone in hand, trying to grasp the reality crashing down on her. Kendra's message accusing Kirk of betrayal had rocked her world. "I spent the night with Kirk. He's been deceiving you." Those words kept echoing in her mind, each time sparking fresh waves of disbelief and rage. How could this happen? How had she not seen the signs? Rasheeda had always put her faith in Kirk, believed in the life they'd created. But now everything felt like it was unraveling. Kendra's accusations were no longer whispers. They were being shared everywhere, on social media, in the press, and among their closest friends. Kirk had been distant for weeks, but Rasheeda never expected this. Her husband, the man she had built a life with, was now at the heart of a scandal she didn't know how to face. At first, she dismissed it. Kendra had a reputation for causing drama. Surely she wasn't being truthful. But deep down, a quiet doubt started to grow. Rasheeda had noticed the changes. Kirk being withdrawn, avoiding her calls, offering vague explanations that didn't add up. Still, she never imagined it would come to this, especially not with someone like Kendra. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Kirk calling, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. What would she even say? What could he possibly say to make any of this right? Nothing could erase the pain. She let the first few calls go unanswered. Then a message appeared. Short and almost pitiful. "Please, Rasheeda, it's not what you think. We need to talk." That was followed by another call, but with her anger rising, Rasheeda set the phone down. She couldn't even begin to imagine having a conversation with him. Kendra's message, the truth she had shared, felt like a deep wound. The trust Rasheeda had placed in Kirk, her partner, her confidant, felt shattered. How had things reached this point? They had built so much together. Their family, their careers, their entire life. And now, everything they had created was on the verge of collapse because of one night Kirk had spent with Kendra. But it wasn't just the act of cheating that cut Rasheeda so deeply. It was the betrayal of their shared foundation, the years of love and commitment that now seemed in jeopardy. Trust and the memories they had shared were now under scrutiny. Rasheeda had built her entire world around Kirk and the dreams they had envisioned together. And now it felt like he had destroyed it all in a single night. It was difficult to accept, but the proof was overwhelming. The conversations Kendra claimed to have had with Kirk, the undeniable bond they seemed to share, everything pointed in one direction. As Rasheeda sat alone in the stillness of her home, waves of pain washed over her. She felt embarrassed, not just because of Kirk's actions, but because the world was now watching her every move unfold. Was this really how things were going to end? Was everything she had fought for, all the sacrifices she had made, going to be undone by one careless decision? Her mind raced with questions. Could she ever forgive him? Should she attempt to fix what was broken in their marriage? Or was this the breaking point? What would her children think? Could she allow them to grow up in a home where trust no longer existed? Each thought only added to the confusion, and no answer felt clear. But even through the heartache, Rasheeda knew she couldn't just sit back and let this destroy her. The next few hours became a blur of phone calls, text messages, and people trying to reach out. Family, friends, and even some of Kirk's associates contacted her to show support. But their words did little to ease the pain. Nothing they said could dull the ache of betrayal. Kirk's infidelity was no longer a private matter. It was out in the open. Everyone knew. There was no undoing it. Still, the world kept turning. Social media erupted with opinions, some siding with Rasheeda, others defending Kirk, and some still doubting Kendra's motives. Reactions were split, with fans arguing fiercely over what Rasheeda should do next, what Kirk's next steps should be, and what Kendra's true motivations might be. Amid the chaos, Rasheeda felt more isolated than ever. She no longer knew what to believe. Kendra's claims had become a public spectacle, and she was expected to play a role in it all. But Rasheeda had no interest in putting on a performance. She wasn't here to toy with emotions. She wanted clarity. She needed to confront Kirk and hear the truth directly from him, no matter how much it hurt. But there was a problem. Kirk wasn't prepared to be completely honest. A few hours later, Rasheeda finally took his call. His voice trembled and he spoke in apologies. But she wasn't looking for excuses. What she needed was the truth, raw, honest, and unfiltered. No more lies, no more hiding. Kirk started speaking almost at once. "Rasheeda, I'm sorry. I never wanted you to find out like this. I should have told you a long time ago. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. I never meant to hurt you." Rasheeda could barely take in his words. Every sentence sounded like a hollow apology, like a man scrambling to save himself instead of owning up to his actions. She didn't want to hear it, not now. The conversation was exhausting. Each word, each sorry, felt like it was tearing her apart. Still, Rasheeda couldn't help but ask. She needed to know what happened, how far it had really gone. But as Kirk spoke of regret, of guilt, and how much he hated himself for what he'd done, Rasheeda felt the distance between them grow even wider. He wasn't the same man she once knew. And yet, despite the fury rising inside her, there was a part of her that didn't want to let go of what they'd shared. She had loved him for so long, and the idea of walking away from everything they'd built felt unbearable. But the truth was undeniable. Their relationship was no longer what it had been. There was no returning to what once was. Kirk, however, didn't seem ready to accept what he'd caused. He kept begging for forgiveness, offering every excuse he could come up with. But none of it changed the facts. Rasheeda had heard enough. The trust had been broken. She didn't know what was ahead, only that, for the first time in a long time, she had to choose her own way forward. And though that was painful, it was the only choice left. This wasn't just about Kendra and Rasheeda anymore. It had become a fight for self-worth, for healing, and for finding a path ahead. Whatever came next, Rasheeda knew she had to keep moving. The days following the bombshell were a blur for Rasheeda. The shock of Kendra's claims still stung, but now the weight of reality was settling in. Kirk's betrayal was no longer a secret. It had become a public affair, and the outside pressure was becoming unbearable. Her phone buzzed constantly, but she couldn't bring herself to pick it up. She felt like she was drowning, buried in a flood of opinions, questions, and expectations. Friends, relatives, even strangers online were weighing in. Everyone had advice. Some urged her to forgive Kirk. Others told her to leave him. Everyone had something to say, but no one could feel what she was feeling. No one else had lived those years of trust, of love, of shared commitment, only to see it all unravel because of Kirk's reckless choices. Kirk's calls kept coming. His messages were filled with apologies and desperate pleas. But Rasheeda couldn't respond. Every time she heard his voice, her anger reignited. How could he? How could he do this to me? Those questions echoed in her head, each time louder than before. She had given him everything, and in return, she got this, a public disgrace she never asked for. Still, even with all the pain, part of her couldn't let go of what they had, their life, the dreams they'd shared. But every second, it felt like it was all crumbling. She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to accept that everything she'd worked so hard to build could fall apart so quickly. Yet, in her heart, she knew things would never go back to how they were. The worst part wasn't even the cheating. It was the lies. Kirk's silence, his refusal to tell the truth. the way he'd twisted everything to protect himself. He had looked her in the eye and lied, again and again, until there was nothing left but a tangled web of deceit. Rasheeda had spent years believing in him, believing in them. But now, that belief felt like a lie too. Kendra's role only added fuel to the fire. There was a time Rasheeda barely noticed her, considered her irrelevant. But now Kendra was at the center of it all. Rasheeda couldn't escape. The woman who had once been a background figure in their world, had suddenly become the face of betrayal. The more Rasheeda thought about it, the more Kendra felt like a force she couldn't control. What did she want? Was this revenge, or was there something deeper? Rasheeda couldn't tell, and honestly, didn't care anymore. One thing was clear: Kendra wasn't finished. The video she'd released, the things she'd said, it was clear she wasn't backing down. Rasheeda could feel the threat of more hanging over her. Sitting in her living room, Rasheeda looked at her phone again. Another message from Kirk appeared on the screen. She sighed and leaned back, closing her eyes. She had tried to ignore it all, to shut out the constant reminders, but it was no use. There was no avoiding it, no denying what had happened. She knew she couldn't keep hiding. She had to make a decision. She could keep ignoring the truth, pretending everything was okay, or she could face it head on. But how? Finally, she made a choice. She would see Kirk. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she couldn't keep dodging the confrontation forever. She needed answers. The following evening, Rasheeda drove to the restaurant they had agreed on. The city was still, the streets dimly lit, as she parked and walked inside. Kirk was already there, seated at a corner table, looking like he hadn't slept in days. He looked up as she approached, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of relief in his eyes, but it quickly disappeared when he caught the look on Rasheeda's face. "Rasheeda," he said quietly, rising as she sat down across from him. "Thank you for coming. I just need to explain everything." Rasheeda glared at him, her expression stern. Explain. She wasn't sure she could stomach any more justifications. She'd already heard too many. "There's nothing to explain, Kirk. You've already made your decisions. I just want to understand. Why? Why Kendra? Why now?" Kirk's expression dropped. He looked like someone who had been through torment, but Rasheeda didn't know if she had any compassion left for him. "It wasn't like that," he said, his voice shaking. "I made a mistake. I was upset, and Kendra, she cornered me. I didn't mean for any of it to happen." "Stop," Rasheeda interrupted sharply. "I don't want to hear your excuses. You made a decision, and now we both have to live with it." Kirk's eyes filled with shame, but Rasheeda wasn't interested in his guilt. She didn't care about his sorrow. She'd heard it all before. "I spent years creating a life with you," she said, her voice trembling. "I gave you everything, Kirk. And you ruined it. You ruined me. What do you want me to do? How am I supposed to get past this?" He reached forward to hold her hand, but she pulled away. She wasn't ready for that, not after what he'd done. "I'm sorry," he said again, his tone soaked in emotion. "Please, I never wanted to hurt you. I love you, Rasheeda. Please give me a chance to fix this." She stared at him in silence, the words weighing heavily on her lips. She had always trusted in their love, but now that love felt like it had shattered. She didn't know if she could put it back together, or if she even wanted to. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Kirk," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't even know who you are anymore." The silence between them lingered, thick with pain. Rasheeda could feel the burden of the decision looming. She didn't know what the right answer was, but she knew this much. It wasn't just about Kirk anymore. It was about her. She wouldn't let him destroy her, not if it meant losing herself. The conversation ended without a real conclusion. Kirk pleaded with her to consider a future together, to rebuild what they had. But Rasheeda knew, whatever came next, it wouldn't be the same. It couldn't be. As she stepped out of the restaurant and into the crisp night, Rasheeda felt a moment of clarity. She didn't know what was ahead, but for the first time, she wasn't scared to face it. She would move forward, even if it meant moving on without Kirk. The days that followed were a blur for Rasheeda, filled with confusion and emotional chaos. The weight of everything, Kendra's claims, Kirk's deception, the eyes of the public, hung over her like a storm that wouldn't pass. The entire world seemed to be watching her every action, eager to see what decision she would make. Everyone had their own opinion, but the only one that truly mattered was hers, and at that moment, she wasn't certain what the right choice was. Despite the whirlwind of emotions surrounding her, one thing was becoming clear. Rasheeda needed to focus on herself. She had spent so much time prioritizing others, Kirk, her family, her career, that she had lost sight of who she was and what she truly needed. She could no longer keep putting everyone else's needs above her own. But as she tried to regain control, the constant reminders of her pain kept crashing into her. Her phone rang repeatedly, but she struggled to answer any calls. There were messages from Kirk, full of apologies, begging her to return home. There were also messages from friends, some offering support, others simply wanting to know what was happening. Then there were the endless social media comments. It seemed like everyone had something to say about her life, her marriage, her every move. She couldn't escape it. Everywhere she went, someone was gossiping about what had happened, spreading rumors or adding fuel to the fire. The public drama was draining her, but Rasheeda wasn't ready to show that she was breaking down. She couldn't afford to fall apart, not now, with so many eyes on her. However, despite the pressure, Rasheeda knew she couldn't continue living in this toxic environment. She had to step away, breathe, and find some clarity. It was time to make decisions that were best for her, without worrying about how others would react. She couldn't continue playing the victim. She was done with that. So she decided to leave the house for a while. She needed to escape the place that had once felt like home, but now served as a constant reminder of everything that had gone wrong. She packed a bag, grabbed her car keys, and drove off into the night, without a specific destination in mind. She simply needed space. She drove aimlessly, her thoughts racing about Kirk, Kendra, and everything that had transpired. The roads were quiet, with only the headlights of her car cutting through the dark, but Rasheeda didn't mind the silence. It was the first time in days that she didn't feel the crushing pressure of the world's gaze. Eventually, Rasheeda found herself at the beach. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was calming, and she felt a wave of peace wash over her as she stepped out of the car. The cool ocean breeze lifted her hair, and she closed her eyes, letting the moment settle in. For so many years, she had tried to please everyone, to maintain appearances, but now, in this quiet, serene moment, she realized how far she had drifted from who she used to be. She had lost touch with the woman who was strong, independent, and fearless in taking control of her life. It was time to reclaim that part of herself. As she walked along the shore, the weight on her chest seemed to lighten. The salty air, the rhythmic sound of the ocean, everything felt like a reminder that life could still hold beauty, even amid pain. She could heal. It wouldn't be simple and it wouldn't happen quickly, but she could begin anew. She deserved that. Later that evening, Rasheeda checked her phone. There were still numerous messages from Kirk, but for the first time, she didn't feel the need to read them. She had already heard enough. What mattered now was what she was going to do, what her next step would be. She decided it was time to concentrate on her career. For so long, her identity had been tied up in her relationship with Kirk, being a wife and a mother, but now it was time to focus on herself. She had always been a skilled businesswoman and had built a successful empire through her hard work. She had let that slip while dealing with the turmoil in her personal life, but she wasn't going to allow that to happen again. The next day, Rasheeda returned to her office. It felt strange being there without Kirk by her side, but she was determined to push forward. She met with her team, discussed new projects, and began putting her energy into her work. For the first time in a while, she felt like she was doing something for herself. But even with her career taking off again, there was still the question of what to do about Kirk. Could she forgive him? Could she ever see him the same way again? She had thought about it deeply, and part of her wanted to give him another chance. She knew how much he had meant to her, how much they had shared, but the more she thought about the lies, the more she realized that forgiveness would take time. Trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight, and the damage had been done. She wasn't sure if she could ever look at him the same way again. The following week, Rasheeda had a meeting with her lawyer. She knew it was time to start planning for her future. No matter what happened with Kirk, she wasn't sure what the next few months would bring, but she knew one thing for sure: she would be fine. She had built a life before Kirk, and she could build a new one now. She had faced challenges before and always emerged stronger. The lawyer handed her several documents to review, and Rasheeda paused to look over them. The reality of it all started to sink in. She was making decisions that would change her life, but she felt an unexpected sense of empowerment. This was her decision. She didn't have to rely on anyone else's opinion anymore. She had the power to shape her future. Meanwhile, the drama continued. Kendra was still making headlines, constantly reminding everyone about the affair. She wasn't backing down and seemed determined to make Rasheeda's life as difficult as possible. But Rasheeda was learning to ignore the noise. Kendra could say whatever she wanted, but it didn't change the fact that Rasheeda was in control of her own life now. Rasheeda focused on what mattered most: her children, her career, and her peace of mind. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She didn't need Kirk to validate her. She had always been strong, and she was learning to be strong again, even without him. As the days passed, Rasheeda grew more confident in her decision to move forward. She didn't know what the future held, but she was no longer afraid of it. She was ready to take the next step, whatever it might be. It wasn't about revenge or anger. It was about reclaiming herself. And although she wasn't sure what would come next, one thing was clear: Rasheeda was no longer going to let anyone dictate her life. She was in control now, and she was determined to build a future on her own terms. The days following Rasheeda's decision to take control of her life felt like a quiet transformation. She wasn't sure where the path ahead would lead, but one thing was certain: she was no longer just reacting to the chaos around her. She was stepping forward, determined to shape her future on her own terms. Kirk, on the other hand, seemed to be spiraling deeper into regret. His constant attempts to reach out only made things worse. Every time he contacted her, Rasheeda's resolve grew stronger. He had betrayed her trust, and no matter how many times he apologized, the damage had already been done. Rasheeda's trust in him had been shattered, and it wasn't something that could be repaired with words alone. Still, there was a lingering part of her that felt the weight of the relationship they once had. She couldn't entirely ignore the good times, the shared history, and the family they had built together. But she knew those moments couldn't erase what he had done. The affair wasn't just a betrayal. It was a betrayal of everything they had promised each other, and that couldn't be forgotten. But Rasheeda wasn't going to sit and wallow in the pain. The realization that she could start fresh, that she had the power to redefine her life, was a powerful one. She threw herself into her work with renewed energy. She had always been passionate about her businesses, and now that passion became her escape. She started making plans for the future: new projects, partnerships, and collaborations. Rasheeda knew she had to focus on her own growth. The world had seen her as Kirk's wife, but she was determined to show them that she was more than that. As the weeks passed, Rasheeda began to feel stronger. She had been through so much already. This wasn't the first time she had been tested, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But this time, she wasn't going to let herself be dragged down by circumstances beyond her control. One afternoon, Rasheeda found herself meeting. She sat again with her lawyer, the divorce papers lying on the table ready for review. This was a pivotal moment. She hadn't reached her final decision yet, but she was drawing closer. The thought of leaving her marriage was daunting, but the idea of staying in a relationship based on lies felt even worse. As she gazed at the papers, Rasheeda realized something crucial. This wasn't merely about ending things with Kirk, it was about moving forward from the past. She had to release the idealized image of her marriage, the one where everything was flawless and unbreakable. The reality was, it had never been like that. Every relationship had its highs and lows, but trust was the foundation that kept it intact. Without trust, there was nothing left to build upon. She signed the papers, her hands steady as she did. It was the hardest decision she'd made in a long time, but in that moment, Rasheeda knew it was the right one. She was choosing herself. She wasn't going to wait for the world or Kirk to determine her worth. Rasheeda took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in months, she felt free. The freedom to be herself, to rediscover who she was, and to rebuild her life without being defined by others' mistakes. As she walked out of the lawyer's office, her phone buzzed again. It was from Kendra, of all people. Rasheeda paused for a moment, then decided to open the message. "I know things are messy right now, Rasheeda, but I want to be clear. I'm not trying to destroy you. I'm just telling the truth. I didn't ask for this either, but I'm not going to apologize for what happened." Rasheeda didn't reply immediately. Part of her wanted to send a harsh message back to lash out at Kendra for everything she had stirred up, but then Rasheeda stopped herself. What would that accomplish? The situation was already out of her control. Kendra had made her choice, and now Rasheeda had to make hers. This was no longer about her. Rasheeda set the phone down, her anger gradually fading. She had accepted everything that had transpired, and she was no longer going to let others dictate who she was. She couldn't change the past, but she could control her future. The following weeks passed in a blur. Rasheeda focused on her businesses, but also began to make time for herself. Time to relax, to think, and to reconnect with what made her happy. She didn't need anyone's approval to move forward. She had built her life on her own, and now she was going to rebuild it again, but this time on her own terms. Kirk, still attempting to repair their relationship, continued sending messages, offering apologies and pleading for forgiveness. But Rasheeda had reached a point where she knew that no amount of apologies would fix what had been broken. She had given everything for him, and now it was time to do something for herself. Finally, the day came when Rasheeda made her decision. She called Kirk, and this time, there was no hesitation in her voice. "I'm done," she said simply. "I can't do this anymore." Kirk tried to argue, begging her to reconsider, but Rasheeda had already made her choice. She had spent too long doubting herself, too long letting him control her happiness. This time, she was choosing herself. And for the first time in a long while, Rasheeda felt a sense of peace. As the days went on, Rasheeda felt a growing sense of closure. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in months, she felt like she was finally moving forward. The storm had passed, and though the scars would remain, Rasheeda knew she was strong enough to face whatever came next. She had taken back her life, and no one could take that away from her. Rasheeda's journey had been a roller coaster, full of betrayal, heartbreak, and ultimately, self-discovery. She had faced unimaginable challenges, but through it all, she had made the courageous choice to move on. Her strength, resilience, and commitment to rebuilding her life were proof that no matter how dark the path seemed, there was always light ahead. Now the question is,